Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 7 in a long series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. If you're the sort of person who likes to understand the full context of a story, you might want to go back and listen to those earlier episodes. If you don't need context and you're comfortable joining us in the middle of the story, then by all means stick around. Last week I covered the foreign affairs of the Soviet Union in the years leading up to the German invasion of 1941. Including the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the USSR and Nazi Germany that divided the spoils of Eastern Europe between them, the clashes with the Japanese over the border with Manchuria and Mongolia, and the Winter War against Finland in 1939 and 1940. This week, I will begin my narrative of the Soviet involvement in the Second World War, which I expect will go on for 3 episodes. This is The End of History, Part 7. I was 12 years old on September 11th, 2001. There are a lot of things I don't remember from when I was 12 years old, but I can recall almost everything about that day in vivid detail. My dad woke me up, brought me into my older brother's bedroom where there was a small TV, which was already on. My brother was already wide awake. We were on the West Coast, and it was very early in the morning. It was not quite yet time to get ready for school. A plane had just crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center in New York, a place that I had just visited as a tourist a year earlier. The newscasters were speculating about whether it was an accident and what the death toll might be, when live on national television I watched a second commercial airliner barrel into the other tower of the World Trade Center, and I understood immediately what that meant. My country, the United States of America, was under attack. We were at war. But with who? Who had attacked us? Why? At that age, I didn't have a complex understanding of global politics. I knew only what I had been taught and what I had experienced spending my childhood in the prosperous years of the 1990s, that America was the greatest, freest country in the world. I couldn't imagine why anybody would want to attack us. As I watched the towers collapse on that small TV in my brother's room, my confusion turned to pain and then to anger. I didn't know how many people had been killed, but I knew it was a lot. I knew that my country, with our strong, unrivaled military, would strike back against whoever was doing this, and I was all for it, as were most Americans at the time, regardless of where they stood on the political spectrum. There was a unity among Americans that I haven't seen before or since. Most of my family had not supported George W. Bush in his run for the presidency, and he was not well thought of in my house. But when he stood on the rubble at Ground Zero and exclaimed, quote, "I hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon," end quote, I cheered just like everybody else. If I had been a few years older, I may have rushed to the nearest recruiting office to join the military, something a lot of people did at the time. 9/11, as it came to be known, was a world-changing, generation-defining moment. Everyone who lived through it, in America and around the world, knew that the world would never be the same afterwards. Yet, there was never really an existential threat to the United States. We'd been sucker punched in a devastating surprise attack, but there was never any possibility that Al-Qaeda would win, and their soldiers would march triumphantly through the streets of American cities and slaughter Americans wholesale across the country. About 3,000 Americans were killed on 9/11, and many thousands more were killed and wounded in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that directly followed it. But as devastating as that is, most Americans didn't know anybody who was killed on 9/11. Outside military families and communities, most Americans probably didn't lose anyone close to them in Iraq or Afghanistan. The war was always distant for most of us, and there was never any doubt that our nation and our people would survive. When the Soviet Union was attacked by Nazi Germany on June 22, 1941, most Soviet citizens were as surprised as Americans were on 9/11. Like Americans on 9/11, many Soviets, especially those from the Russian majority, rallied around their government in defense of their country, even if they disliked its leaders. They felt similar shock, hurt, and anger to that felt by Americans on 9/11. But the scale of the attack was so much bigger. It was so large and the potential consequences so grave that it's almost incomprehensible from a Western point of view. Rather than thousands, millions would die. Not a single family was untouched by the devastation of the war. The Nazis meant to destroy not just their government and political system, but the whole people. It was a war of annihilation. The Soviet people faced the very real possibility that they might perish, and they overcame it. If you're an American and you're a history buff like me, and I assume if you've made it this far into my podcast that you are, then your understanding of World War II and the European theater probably centers on the Western Front. I know I grew up thinking that D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge were the decisive battles of World War II in Europe. The books I read and the documentaries I watched may have mentioned the Eastern Front, but it was usually an afterthought. There would be a segment about the initial German invasion in 1941, a short snippet about Stalingrad, then it would jump right to the Battle of Berlin at the end of the war. The truth is that the Eastern Front is where the Second World War was decided. 7 out of every 8 German soldiers who died in the war died fighting the Soviets. By any metric, the Second World War is the largest conflict in human history. But if you were to separate every other theater of the war and only count the Eastern Front, it would still be the largest war in human history. This is not to discount the efforts of the British and Americans in the war, which nationalistic Russian histories often do. I've had conversations with some of my Russian friends about what they learned in school about World War II, or as they call it, the Great Patriotic War, and the narrative basically boils down to this: that the Soviet Union bore the entire brunt of the war effort basically on their own, and that the Western Allies waited on the sidelines until after Stalingrad, and then jumped in after it was clear the Soviets would win. This narrative is also nonsense. But the most important American contributions to the war, especially in the early years from 1941 to 1943, was material rather than military. In 1941, no country on Earth came anywhere close to the productive industrial capacity of the United States. It is said that after declaring war on the United States, Hitler laughed off the projections of American industrial capabilities given to him by his advisors as fanciful. Their projections were actually low. The Red Army depended on supplies from the United States to keep their massive armies supplied. Jeeps and GM trucks were a common sight in the Red Army during World War II, as were American-made tanks and airplanes. Supplies of food from the United States also kept the Red Army fed. Spam, in particular, was a treasured delicacy among Red Army soldiers. To this day, spam is a common ingredient in Russian cooking. While spam is by no means universally loved by Russians, it is, based on my experience, significantly more popular in Russia than it is in the West. A little over 400,000 American servicemen died in the Second World War. It remains the deadliest war in our history other than the American Civil War, where we count casualties from both sides. This is not a small number, and American bravery and sacrifice made a great contribution to the Allied victory. I'm in no way trying to minimize this, but the number is a drop in the bucket compared to the Soviet Union. So many Soviet citizens died in World War II that we don't know and probably never will know the true number. Estimates usually range between 20 and 30 million. Some estimates are even higher. In the siege of Leningrad alone, between 1941 and 1944, more Russians died than the entire war dead of the United States and the United Kingdom combined. But it was the war in the East that broke the Nazis. Without the struggle and sacrifice of the Soviet Union, fascism could not have been defeated, and our world would look very different today. I'm going to go into greater detail on the Second World War than perhaps I have in earlier episodes, because this conflict, more than anything else, defined the Soviet Union and continues to define modern Russia. The war did not begin well for the Soviet Union. The Germans launched a massive surprise attack on the USSR beginning before daylight on June 22, 1941. The attack should have surprised nobody. As I covered at the end of the episode last week, Stalin had plenty of warning that the attack was coming. British intelligence had agents inside the German government, and the British tried to warn Stalin. When Stalin refused to believe them, the British passed information to the Americans, who were not yet at war with Germany and enjoyed better relations with the USSR. And the US ambassador attempted to warn Stalin as well. Stalin distrusted him just as much as the British. Finally, Stalin's own spies and military scouts warned him of the massive German troop buildup on the border, but he took no action. Stalin was convinced that the West was concocting a ruse to drag him into war with Nazi Germany, and that the troop buildup and movements along the border were an attempt by rogue German officers to provoke a war without Hitler's knowledge or approval. For some strange reason, and I honestly can't explain it, Stalin, who trusted absolutely nobody, seems to have trusted Hitler to keep his word vis-a-vis the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact. Perhaps he thought that Hitler wouldn't risk a war with the USSR while Britain was still in the fight? I can only speculate. As far as I know, this question has never been answered. Not only did Stalin ignore the warnings, but he actually denied permission to his military commanders along the western border to make defensive preparations against a German attack. He accused those who raised the alarm of spreading panic and assured them that there would be no war. Thus, when the attack came, the German army achieved complete surprise. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the first day, mostly on the ground, still parked wingtip to wingtip, easy targets for the battle-hardened German Luftwaffe. Some Red Army units were refused permission to return fire against the attacking Germans because their commanders, relying on assurances from Stalin, did not believe they were really under attack. For his part, Stalin seems to have had a nervous breakdown when the attack came, making the situation that much worse. Georgy Zhukov, whose victories over the Japanese in the Far East in 1939 had seen him promoted to the upper echelon of Red Army command, wrote in his memoir years later that when he called Stalin to inform him of the attack, Stalin could not bring himself to respond. All Zhukov could hear on the other end of the phone was the sound of Stalin's heavy breathing. Stalin eventually gave permission for the Red Army to defend themselves against the Germans, but ordered them only to defend Soviet territory and take no offensive actions. He still thought this was a provocation by rogue German generals and that Hitler must be unaware. He sent his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, to the German embassy to speak with the German ambassador in person and straighten this whole thing out. The German ambassador coldly informed Molotov that Germany was declaring war. Stalin knew he had badly miscalculated, and he couldn't bring himself to speak to the people. He appointed Molotov to address the nation on his behalf. Molotov gave a halfway decent speech over the radio. He appealed to the patriotism of Russian people, invoking the defeat of Napoleon, and promising that Hitler would suffer the same fate. He closed with the words, quote, "Our cause is just. The enemy shall be defeated. Victory will be ours." End quote. These words would go on to paint Soviet propaganda posters for the remainder of the war. But as powerful as Molotov's speech was, people wondered why they were hearing from him and not from Stalin. In those first few days, Stalin gave lots of broad, often contradictory military orders that took no account of actual conditions on the ground. And to be fair to Stalin, the system he had cultivated made it unlikely that he actually knew the dire state of the situation at the front. His commanders were too afraid to deliver bad news to him. Slowly, information leaked back to Moscow, revealing the true nature of the war's early days. Thousands of tanks and airplanes, the pride of the Red Army, had been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, entire armies, were killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of thousands more were cut off and surrounded by the rapid German armored advance. Many of them would be forced to surrender in the coming days and weeks. The Germans advanced rapidly, with some units advancing as much as 50 kilometers, that's 31 miles, on the first day. Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, was captured on June 26th, and a massive Soviet army was cut off and surrounded nearby. This scenario played out across the Western Soviet Union, as armies were routed or cut off and surrounded as the Germans advanced rapidly into the Soviet heartland. Stalin finally emerged from his isolation and addressed the nation on July 3rd. A number of Soviet citizens would later recount this as something of a turning point. In his speech, Stalin spoke little of the party or of communism, but appealed to the patriotic spirit of the people instead. He addressed the people as, quote, brothers and sisters, and called on them to wage a great patriotic war to beat back the German invasion. He lied about the extent of the damage inflicted on the invaders, telling the people that the Germans' best divisions had been smashed, but he was also forced to acknowledge the severity of the threat, stating that, quote, "This is a matter of the life and death of the Soviet state, of the life and death of the peoples of the USSR." He called on those in areas occupied by the enemy to form partisan bands and resist. He also called for a scorched earth campaign. Everything of value was to be either disassembled and removed to the Urals or beyond, or be destroyed. Nothing was to be left for the Germans. What followed was possibly one of the greatest logistical efforts of all time, as hundreds of factories were disassembled in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, loaded onto trains, and taken to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, where it would all be reassembled and the Soviet industrial machine completely rebuilt. Thousands of volunteers flocked to recruiting stations across the USSR, eager to volunteer for the Red Army, though it would yet be a while before these recruits could be trained and equipped well enough to make any real difference at the front. Meanwhile, in those areas already occupied by the Germans, people followed Stalin's instructions and started forming guerrilla bands known as partisans, that soon became a veritable army operating against German lines of supply and communication. Nazi brutality towards Soviet prisoners of war and the citizens of the occupied territory swelled the ranks of these partisan bands. The Germans, keeping to their Nazi ideology, treated Soviet prisoners of war as less than human. Political commissars and any Jewish prisoners of war were immediately separated and summarily executed. Those who remained were forced into long death marches toward work camps far from the front lines. Anyone who struggled to keep up with these marches was shot along the way. When they reached their work camps, the prisoners of war were kept on starvation diets and systematically worked to death. Estimates vary, but it's generally accepted that between 3 and 4 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity during the war. A large majority of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers who fell into German captivity. As the German army advanced deeper into the Soviet Union, it was followed by special SS squads known as the Einsatzgruppen, tasked with rounding up and mass executing Jews and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi state. These death squads would move into towns and villages and systematically round up the local Jewish population for execution. In Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, the Baltic states, and Western Russia, about 1.5 million Jewish civilians were systematically murdered by the Nazis in 1941 and 1942. Most of them were shot. The perpetrators of these crimes later exhibited signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which led Nazi planners to opt for the much less personal method of execution by gas chamber when they adopted the quote-unquote final solution as official policy in the winter of 1942-1943. In total, it's estimated that about 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazi state in the Holocaust between 1941 and 1945. Meanwhile, life was no picnic for the non-Jewish Slavic people under Nazi occupation in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Particularly in the rural villages of Ukraine, where peasants had been severely brutalized by Stalin during the collectivization process, many initially greeted the Germans as liberators. Videos from this time can be found showing Ukrainian villagers greeting the advancing German army with the traditional offering of bread and salt. However, as Slavs, Nazi ideology also held these Ukrainians to be, quote, subhuman, and thus they were treated with remarkable brutality. Like the Soviets before them, Germans stole their food and left them to starve. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians were murdered for actual or perceived opposition to the occupation. Thousands more were murdered for giving food or support to the partisan units operating in their area. Thousands of women were raped. Thousands starved to death, and thousands more were conscripted by the German army for forced labor, either locally or back in Germany. The German general Erich von Manstein said, referring to Ukraine, quote, "A large part of the population will have to go hungry. Nothing, out of a misguided sense of humanity, may be given to them." End quote. While some Ukrainians and others in the occupied regions of the USSR chose collaboration with the Germans, more chose resistance. Those who chose resistance, however, did not all choose the pro-Soviet partisans. Especially in Ukraine, but in other regions as well, rival nationalist guerrilla units formed, hoping to break free of both Nazi and Soviet rule. This conflict was incredibly complicated and messy. These nationalist factions would, at various times, make alliances with the Soviet partisans against the Germans, and at other times, they would turn around and cooperate with the Germans against the Soviet partisans. This occasional cooperation with the Germans gives the grain of truth used to support the lie in modern Russian propaganda that Ukrainian nationalism is necessarily equivalent to Nazism. Broadly, the mistreatment of both POWs and civilians led to increased resistance in the German rear. The Scorched Earth campaign left little for the Germans to use from the occupied territory and stretched their supply lines. At the same time, Soviet resistance at the front was slowly becoming stiffer and more coordinated. However, Stalin's incompetent blunders still stymied the Soviet war effort to a large degree. In August, Stalin forbade the Red Army to abandon Kiev in a strategic retreat, declaring any commander who pulled his troops back would be shot as a coward and a traitor. By September, the Germans had completely encircled Kiev, leaving about 450,000 Soviet troops trapped in the pocket. Before the end of the month, those who survived would all be in German captivity, where most of them would perish. To the north, Leningrad, Russia's second largest city, had also been encircled on September 8th, with the Germans holding the south and their Finnish allies, who had joined the war against the USSR in hopes of regaining lost territory, holding the north. Unlike Kiev, Leningrad held out. The siege would go on until January 1944. More than 1 million Soviet civilians would perish in Leningrad during that time, many of them from starvation. Yet through all the hardships, the citizens of Leningrad endured. In the fall of 1941, outside observers did not think the Soviets could recover from these seemingly catastrophic blows. In the British government, the consensus was generally that Moscow would fall and the Soviet resistance would collapse. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, was a bit more optimistic, telling a subordinate that he would give him 500-1 odds against the Red Army collapsing in defeat. It's possible that Churchill was posturing by speaking highly of his newest ally to keep morale in his government up, but from the time of the German invasion, Churchill became a stalwart ally of the Soviet Union. For those of you that may not know much about Winston Churchill, it's important to point out the man was an ardent conservative and probably Britain's most outspoken anti-communist. But in 1941, he led a beleaguered country that had stood alone against Hitler for the better part of a year. Now, despite the military setbacks of the summer, he had a huge ally in that war. When some expressed surprise that Churchill suddenly supported the Soviet Union after years as an anti-communist crusader, he is said to have replied, quote, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." End quote. Churchill's very quotable. After Kiev fell and Leningrad was surrounded in September, the Germans were able to divert the main body of their force toward the central drive on Moscow, which began in earnest in early October. The further into Soviet territory the Germans moved, the more resistance stiffened. German supply lines grew longer and Soviet ones shorter. The German troops were also growing exhausted. However, the German Wehrmacht, the army at this time that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, speaking purely of their military and not their moral virtues, was a very good one. They continued to advance. By mid-October, German troops were just 50 kilometers, 31 miles from the Kremlin. Then, the annual weather phenomenon known in Russia as the Rasputitsa brought heavy rains that turned the unpaved roads on the approaches to Moscow to mud, through which the German vehicles could not move. It didn't stop the German advance, but it slowed it down enough to give the Soviets time to regroup. On October 10th, command of the Red Army units in and around Moscow had been given to Georgy Zhukov, an extremely talented commander who we talked about briefly last week. Zhukov immediately went about building up Moscow's defenses. The civilian population was conscripted to dig trenches and construct tank barriers. On October 31st, the German offensive ground to a halt due to the overwhelming mud on the roads. With the Germans only a few miles from the city, plans were made for Stalin and the other party leaders to evacuate from Moscow. Contemporary accounts from those close to Stalin indicate that he did consider fleeing Moscow, going as far as to pack his things. But prompted by Zhukov, who told him in late October that the city would hold, Stalin chose to stay and make his stand in Moscow. By not running away, Stalin, for once, showed true leadership when the country needed it the most. It did not go unnoticed by the people that the supreme leader stood with them in Moscow, and contemporary accounts from soldiers indicate this had a real positive effect on morale. On November 15th, the ground had frozen and the German vehicles could move again. They renewed their offensive. The German soldiers were exhausted. Most of the German divisions were at about half strength, some were as low as 1/3 strength. They'd been fighting since June, and now the freezing temperatures raised a new concern. They had not been provided winter clothing or equipment. At the same time, however, they knew how close they were to Moscow. They could smell the victory, and they pushed on with determination. What they didn't know, indeed what even the German High Command didn't know, was that the Soviets had a massive strategic reserve of manpower that was still completely untapped. The 1,100,000 troops of the Siberian Front. Among the most elite divisions in the Red Army, these troops were well equipped for extreme winter conditions and well trained to operate in them. Since the summer, they had been guarding the Far East against a potential Japanese attack. The Japanese were allied with Nazi Germany, and this was a reasonable expectation, but no Japanese attack came. In November, word got back to Stalin from his spies in Japan that the Japanese were planning to attack the United States and United Kingdom, but had no plans to join the war against the Soviet Union. For once, Stalin decided to believe the intelligence he was being given, and he relented to Zhukov's request to bring these troops west to fight the Germans. On December 4th, some German troops were less than 20 miles from the Kremlin. Many German veterans of the campaign reported that they could see Moscow in the distance. On that same day, the temperatures in the Moscow area plummeted to negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly the same in Celsius. Oil in the German tanks and other vehicles froze, and the army was immobilized. The offensive ground to a halt. The next day, on December 5th, Zhukov unleashed the Siberians. The Germans had been caught completely off guard by this counteroffensive of more than 1 million well-equipped, well-trained fresh troops. Thousands of German soldiers were killed, thousands more were taken prisoner. As Soviet troops advanced and they liberated occupied territory, they saw with their own eyes for the first time evidence of the brutality against Soviet civilians. After that, many of them became less inclined to take prisoners at all. The German armies were pushed back from the outskirts of Moscow, and multiple German divisions were cut off and encircled near Vyazma. The Soviet counteroffensive ran out of steam by early January, but it had been a crushing victory. The German campaign to destroy the Soviet Union in a rapid blitzkrieg in 1941 had failed. The war would continue into another year and become a war of attrition. It was the first major victory by any of the Allied powers against Nazi Germany, and the victory destroyed the myth of German invincibility. For the first time, the Soviets and their allies began to believe that they could win. As the counteroffensive was unfolding, on the other side of the world, the Japanese had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. 4 days later, on December 11th, Hitler declared war on the United States to support his Japanese allies, bringing the United States directly into the war with Hitler. In just a few short days, the ground had shifted beneath Hitler's feet, and the war was now taking a very different turn. That's everything for today. Thank you all for listening. If you haven't already, I encourage you to engage with us on social media and to visit our website at www.thehistorysphere.com. If you like what you heard and you want to support the show, you can support us on Spotify with a monthly donation. If you don't have Spotify or you prefer to listen elsewhere, you can also support us on Patreon. The link to our Patreon can be found on the website. There will be no new episode next week, as I will be traveling out of town with my family. When we return in 2 weeks, I will cover the Titanic battles of 1942 and 1943, as the tide is turned and the Soviet Union begins to emerge as the superpower it would become. As always, thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.